Hello world, it's Austin. Let's talk about being transgender and Christian. This week has been hard and it's left me with a lot more questions than answers. It's been a terrible week for our human family. A lot of terrible, destructive things have happened, and we've seen it more than we usually do, which is saying something. This week, too, on November 20th, we hold Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is a day to remember all of the trans people that have died and been killed in the past year and in years before. This year so far, in 2015, the list currently numbers 74 individual people. Sometimes it seems like we're surrounded by death, like it's something that keeps coming to the forefront of our minds and won't be ignored. How do we respond to this? How do we mourn those who have died and work to prevent that kind of death in the future and hold our own fear of death all at the same time? And where is God in all of this? Where is God in Beirut and Paris and Kenya and Chicago and everywhere else that people have died and people die too young? For most of my life, I've been told that you can see God in the helpers, in the people that do incredible things and have incredible kindness towards others in these terrible situations. You can see God in the people in Paris that opened up their houses to people fleeing the destruction, and you can see God in Adele Termos, who tackled one of the men with explosives in Beirut, and you can see God in all of the people that are helping Syrian refugees right now. I think that's true. You can see God in the helpers. But sometimes, too, this immense weight of loss and destruction feels like too much, and like these people are sparks, but maybe they're not big enough to help us deal with this huge weight. In seminary, I had this one particular professor who used to talk about how because Jesus suffered, that means that God has suffered, and God knows what suffering is. And so every time we experience suffering, God is there in that suffering at the same time. This professor never asked us to look for the bright side or look for the helpers. He always had us look directly at the hardest parts of life and to say, God is there too. This fact that we are never alone in our hurt and in our sorrow and in our mourning helps a lot of people, including me. But at the same time, you have to wonder, if God is there and if God cares, then why doesn't God do something? Why doesn't God stop the murder of 74 trans people in 12 months? And why doesn't God change the hearts of suicide bombers? Why doesn't God do something? Much of the latter parts of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, have the stories of prophets and other characters who cry out to God and ask this question, God, why aren't you doing something? Some of these prophets come to a kind of understanding over time, and others don't. My favorite prophet, Isaiah, spends the last portion of his book talking about the new kingdom of God, what this will look like in the future, and that's where we get a lot of the imagery for the kingdom of God that Jesus uses in the New Testament. The prophet Isaiah experienced the movement of the people of Israel out of exile. He got to be there after all of the terrible things that had happened to them, after all of the doom and gloom prophecy of the terrible things that would happen. Isaiah finally got to be the one to speak good news. He finally got to see God's work in the world on a grand scale for all of his people. In chapter 61, Isaiah says this, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and to release the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of the vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, and to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit." And for Isaiah, these words may have been just for the people of Israel in his time and place, but Jesus speaks these very same words again in Luke chapter 4. Jesus says that he too has been sent to bring good news to the oppressed and to release the captives and to bind up the brokenhearted, and that means that these words are for us too. This week, many of us feel broken, and many of us are mourning, Mourning is necessary, and it's healing, and it's one of the reasons why we hold Trans Day of Remembrance, because we need a place to come together to acknowledge that pain and to be strength for each other and to remember those who have died. And when we gather in our mourning and in our suffering, God is there in that pain. And God says, I know that feeling, and I will stay here with you. But that's not where the story ends. And when Jesus said that he's been sent to bind up the brokenhearted, that means that there's a way forward somehow. The story doesn't end with suffering on Good Friday. There's more to it. And I wonder if it's possible to hold that hope of moving forward even while we are still oppressed and captive and brokenhearted. Maybe it's like knowing that no matter how long the night feels, the sun will come up. Maybe sometimes these sparks of goodness that we see don't feel like enough, but maybe they're just enough to see by. Or maybe we just need to sit in the dark and in the quiet for a while and know that God is with us. This week, as we remember those who have died, I hope you remember that you're not alone. I hope you remember that there is a way forward for all of us together. Hold each other gently this week, everybody, and I'll see you back here next Wednesday. Peace.